Two and a Half Admins, episode 170. I'm Joe.
I'm Jim.
And I'm Allan.
And here we are again. Allan, you finally decided that one tiny access point in your house was not enough and you would take Jim's advice and go down the TP-Link route with the Armada controller and all of that. So tell us why and how you did it.
Yeah, so since 2013, I think, the Wi-Fi at my house has been this little portable USB device that's like half the size of a deck of cards. So about as thick as a deck of cards, but only half as tall. And it has pass-through Ethernet. So the way they sell this device in Japan is, you power it over USB, probably off your laptop. If you're in a hotel and it has an in-room Ethernet jack, you plug that Ethernet into this device and it gives off Wi-Fi so all your other devices can use that cabled Ethernet rather than the Wi-Fi or if there wasn't Wi-Fi. But it has a pass-through so your laptop could still be connected and have full wire speed to the internet. Especially in Japan, back then, gigabit speeds were common, but Wi-Fi couldn't do a gigabit yet. So there was actually an advantage to having your laptop hardwired in.
In the mid-2000s, we called those game controllers. You could buy a wireless to Wi-Fi bridge and spend $350, or you could get something exactly as functional in like fun gamer colors that was marketed to Xbox and PlayStation users who didn't have a wired Ethernet port, only had Wi-Fi. But if you bought the one for the game console, it was $50 instead of $350. I still remember I had a car dealership client who needed that functionality, and I brought in one of those game adapters. And, it's all Mountain Dew looking with stripes on it and neon green. And he complained about it. And I told him just what I told you. I said, well, you can have this for $50. You can have one in nice, sober business colors for $350 that does the exact same thing. It's like, you know what? I like Mountain Dew.
So this one is plain white with one yellow and one blue Ethernet port and was $23 Canadian in Japan.
Yeah, but it only did like wireless N or something.
Yes, which was the newest wireless at the time. Right? I bought this in 2013. And like Jim said, it had 3 different modes. In one mode, it was, I have a device that needs cabled internet and I need to connect to Wi-Fi. So you could do it that. And so, yeah, it was for the game connector. Or also at the time, it's like, oh, I have this laptop and its wireless card is not supported by my open source operating system. So if I plug this little USB device in with a tiny Ethernet cable, I can go to an HTTP address on the local network and tell it which Wi-Fi to connect to, and it will, and I'll have Ethernet to Wi-Fi. And it worked great for that, or you can use all these other ways. I've also seen a friend of mine use it on an airplane where you had to pay for the Wi-Fi. He paid for that device to connect once, and then connected all of his devices and his seatmates' devices off of that one access point instead, using it as a wireless bridge.
So fast forward 10 years and you've not needed to upgrade this because you don't really use much Wi-Fi, right? Like everything in your house is Ethernet. You've got drops everywhere in every room and sockets and everything's wired in. But now you've decided finally is the time to get with the times.
Yeah, there are a couple of different events that change. Like I said, most of the time it's just my phones and devices like that are using the Wi-Fi. But the spectrum around me has changed a bit. More neighbors getting more and more Wi-Fi devices and so on. And it got to the point, if I was at the back of my house, say in the bathroom or in my office, my phone would drop off the Wi-Fi like frequently. It would be fine. And then just like, oh, no Wi-Fi. And it was just happening more and more. And I was getting really upset with it. And I decided that maybe it was useful to get better Wi-Fi, but also get something that actually started using 5 gigahertz because basically all my stuff was only 2.4.
That's where your real problem was.
Yes. So I talked to Jim about it and got the specific recommendations. So I bought 3 of these, I think, EAP225 access points, stuck one at the front of the house, one at the back of the house, and one in the basement. I have great coverage now. And bought the little Omada controller, the OC200, to control them all. And specifically what I wanted from that was the wired backhaul so that none of my Wi-Fi devices are talking to each other over Wi-Fi. Like the access points are not relaying each other over Wi-Fi because as we talked about, that takes up even more airtime, leaving less for the devices. So I wanted definitely something that was going to do wired backhaul for the real mesh and fast roaming and all that.
So did you have cables in your ceilings then?
Not exactly. Most of the Ethernet jacks I have are beside electrical outlets.
Yeah.
So One of them, the access point is actually just sitting on the top of a bookshelf.
Right.
Because it fell off the wall and I tried to use 3M things to hang it because I didn't want to put screws in the wall. But it's high enough and it works totally fine. It's an omnidirectional. It doesn't matter.
On top of a bookshelf is a great way to cite APs when you don't want to do like proper bolt to the wall kind of thing. I have absolutely nothing bad to say about on top of a 5 or 6 foot bookshelf. That's pretty close to ideal.
Yep. And then, there's one in this room here, mostly because it blasts across the house and covers the toilet very well.
That's the crux of this, isn't it, Alan? You mentioned the bathroom and now you mentioned the toilet. You just want to read while you're, doing that kind of business, right?
In the 1980s, if you were the real thing, you had the phone in the shitter. Well, it's 2023, and now we want 802.11ac, and we want it proper.
So part of the problem is my phone will be fine, because if it drops out the Wi-Fi, it uses the 5G, and I don't notice. But my second device that I use to play games currently is Wi-Fi only. And so when it kept dropping off in the middle of a game, it was really frustrating me. And it didn't used to happen. It was just the Wi-Fi spectrum around me has gotten so crowded, especially on 2.4 gigahertz.
I'm picturing a battle station in your bathroom.
No, it's literally my old Pixel 2 or whatever.
No, I'm just going to imagine it's two 27-inch monitors and a fat desktop.
My bathroom is not that big, sadly. But, my girlfriend was also complaining that the reception in other parts of the house wasn't great either. If you're sitting on the wrong end of the couch, there was just no coverage. And basically, it used to reach everywhere and not be a problem. But as it's got more and more crowded in my neighborhood, it's become part of a problem. I think a lot of that has to do, like Jim talked about, people cranking up the power on their antennas without understanding that doesn't actually help anything. All it does is piss off your neighbors.
And probably more IoT stuff as well that's going to be crowding the 2.4.
Yes. And there was a high school across the road from my house. They closed it down and stopped using it, but then they reopened it as the Education Archives in a continuing education building, part of the same school board. And so they've just done a bigger Wi-Fi install, and apparently, it reaches across the street. A friend of mine that works for the department, when he comes over to my house, he uses the Wi-Fi from across the road. And so I think that was also part of it is changes that are going on there. But it was really nice to just plug in the first access point, and then I could reach it over the network and log in and program it however I wanted. So it works fine as a standalone one. But once I plugged in the controller, I had the option to adopt it. And when I adopted all 3 and configured them and put names on them, it all worked very nice. Slight complication originally was one of them wasn't plugged into a dedicated Ethernet drop. It was plugged into a switch that then, one drop that feeds a switch to a whole bunch of small devices, like the office printer, a big TV, and a couple other devices that are all basically share one port by plugging into a dumb switch that doesn't understand VLANs. But the default VLAN on that port is the office network, not my home network. And so I got the controller to talk to it, but then if it tagged the packets for the VLAN correctly, it worked, but then the other ones didn't work properly. Basically, I would end up double tagging some of the packets and then they wouldn't find the right VLAN. So it took a little rearranging my home network and basically simplifying the number of VLANs I had a little bit. But I did manage to also create a separate guest network that does have a VLAN. So every packet that's done on that guest network is tagged with a different VLAN, and my router gives out a completely different range of IP addresses. And so the guest machines can't have any access. Although the Amada has options to not require that, where you can have it be part of the same network, just a guest SSID, and it's going to use the same subnet, but have a list that says these people on the guest network can't go to any private IP addresses, only to the internet, and stop them from being able to see any traffic back and forth from your home network without having to have VLANs, which I found not what I needed, but as a really nice feature for, normal people.
Yeah, it's very handy for folks who are not, full-on network administrators. Getting into VLANs for the first time can be a little intimidating.
Right, or just other people wouldn't have a switch that even would let them have a mix of tagged and untagged VLANs all over the place and so on, like I do.
So you mentioned earlier that most of your Ethernet jacks are right by a power outlet. Does that mean that you're using injectors instead of a PoE switch?
Yeah, I'm using the injectors that came in the box with the things because, they're all over the place and nowhere near a PoE switch.
Well, I mean, you just buy a PoE switch and, put it in the DMARC and
But they're not all even in the same switch. The one in the basement piggybacks onto my home rack switch, whereas the other 2, because they're upstairs, feed into the switch in the laundry room, and neither of those are PoE.
So to be clear to anybody listening who's struggling a little bit with the terminology, wired access points like these TP-Link or like the Ubiquitys that you've probably heard a lot more about, they can be power over Ethernet. Typically there's only going to be one single jack on the device, and that's going to be a power over Ethernet capable Ethernet jack. So you get your data and your power off of just one cable. Now, if you don't have a power over Ethernet capable switch, then you can use an injector. And the way the injector works is you have a data line going into it, you've got a data and power line going out of it, and you plug the injector into the power line. So what it's injecting is the power over Ethernet into your data stream. Now, if I recall, I think these TP-Link switches also have like a 12-volt barrel jack option, and I've seen that on a couple of people's APs.
Yeah, a couple of the access points do. The particular model I bought did not.
Right.
There was also a model that had a second Ethernet jack, so you could kind of daisy chain a bunch of them together if you couldn't feed PoE or Ethernet to all of them. Having it up on the wall here is definitely nice to be able to just have one cable go to that, especially if that cable is inside the wall, as opposed to having to run power and Ethernet separately. So yeah, it's really nice, although all three of mine are just using the PoE injectors that came in the box because I don't actually have a PoE switch or much need for one.
Allan already knows all this stuff, and Joe probably knows half of it, but for everybody else's benefit, there's nothing wrong technically with using the PoE injectors. As a matter of fact, I'm not proud of it, but my access points in my house are still all using injectors. The downside to using the injectors is no matter what you do, if you're using injectors, they're going to be ugly, like octopus making love to a hat rack kind of looks, because you've got one Ethernet coming in and one Ethernet going out and a third cable for the power. And so now you've got to be near the power jack and the Ethernet jack, and you probably don't really want your access point very near to either in most cases. So even if you're going to have exposed cables and not a cable in the wall, it's a huge improvement to just have that one single Ethernet and that's it. Makes it real easy to hide away, like, in a section of cheap raceway that just like glues onto the wall or whatever. Lots of nice options here. The other really nice thing about doing power over Ethernet is that gives you the option of putting your entire Wi-Fi network on a UPS, a single UPS. You plug your power over Ethernet switch into a simple uninterruptible power supply, and when the power goes out, your Wi-Fi is still functioning because all of your APs are on that UPS. They're also power protected on that UPS. I have a particular client that I absolutely had to implement this for because when they onboarded with me, this was a private school and they had about 120 access points or so. An absolute guarantee, anytime it rained, the next morning, at least 5 or 6 of the damn things would be offline. So once I put in proper PoE with UPS behind it and got everything centrally managed that way and centrally protected, doesn't matter if it rains or not, even though they don't necessarily care about the uptime over a power outage, insulating them that way from the vagaries of power meant that they no longer had to be like manually rebooted after something weird happened to confuse them, which is really nice.
At first I was like, if I had more, I might bother with a PoE switch. But then you brought up the UPS point. And my switch is connected to a UPS on purpose because I need my internet to stay up when the power goes out. Everything else is on proper batteries and everything. Maybe it's worth me replacing that old Netgear switch that's hanging from the ceiling in the laundry room with something that can do PoE just so my Wi-Fi will also stay up.
Exactly. And it absolutely is worth it because that was the next point I was going to get to is power over Ethernet switches used to be very expensive. They are not very expensive anymore. Usually the most sensible thing now is not even to buy like a separate switch, but just upgrade whatever switch you got. Power over Ethernet on all the ports. You'll be very happy that you did that later because more and more IoT type things support power over Ethernet and it makes life a lot easier if you've already got it. Do you want to hang wired security cameras that have their own power? Again, with UPS, battery backed up the whole nine. Well, if you've replaced your 24-port switch that you run your house off of, or 16-port or whatever, replace it with a PoE-capable switch. All your ports are available for that. You don't have to think about it like which ports can I use for this and do I have to use for the other or a bunch of switches. No, man. Everything's just easy. It just works. You just know that line goes from my switch to wherever in the house and supplies both the power and the data, and it's done. It's very nice. I've actually already bought the switches to upgrade my existing setup. I just still haven't gotten around to deploying them.
Yeah, I've been thinking about doing the doorbell cam type thing or something. And also, the switch in the laundry room is 10 years old and the firmware is terrible. something better might be nice. And with how impressed I've been about the TP-Link stuff I just bought, I'm guessing the Switch from the same series would be a good choice.
It absolutely is. I use tons of those things. Now, the thing to be aware of on that is basically you're going to come across two separate lines with TP-Link for the Power over Ethernet capable switches, the Easy Smart PoE switch and the Jetstream. Now, the Jetstream costs more, but if you want to monkey around with VLANs and stuff like that, you absolutely want to get the Jetstream. If you don't care about VLANs and you don't really care about like a management interface, you just essentially want it to act like a dumb switch, that's when you want the Easy Smart. It doesn't save you that much money anymore, so I tend to recommend if you're at all not sure, just buy the Jetstream. But on the other hand, if you know for a fact, like I don't even want to log into my Switch, I just want a thing to plug stuff into, then the Easy Smart's all you need.
So Allan, how much did all this cost you then?
In total, it was under $400 Canadian, which is under $300 US.
And that's for 3 access points.
3 access points with the PoE injectors and the wall mounting kits and all the bits included, and the separate controller, which if you just want to run the controller in software or use the smartphone app or whatever, you don't necessarily need. But I didn't want to faff with running their software, and the hardware controller was a good solution for me.
And if you want to add a PoE switch to what Allan has done, you've got several options we've talked about. If you want to go the cheapest route, you can get a 16-port Easy Smart from TP-Link for $150. And if you want to upgrade to the Jetstream I was talking about, and they don't have a 16-port Jetstream right now that I could find, you need to go up to 24-port, and that is $300 currently.
Okay, this episode is sponsored by people who support us with PayPal and Patreon. Go to 2.5admins.com/support for details of how you can support us too. 2.5 Admins is part of the Late Night Linux family, which means that for $10 a month on Patreon, you get access to an RSS feed that contains all the Late Night Linux family shows without adverts like this. There's also an option to get just this show ad-free for $5 a month if you prefer. Some of the episodes are even released a day or so early for Patreon supporters. So, if you like what we do and can afford it, it would be great if you could support us at 2.5admins.com/support. Let's do some free consulting then. But first, just a quick thank you to everyone who supports us with PayPal and Patreon. We really do appreciate that. And if you want to send in your questions for Jim and Allan, you can email show@2.5admins.com. Ben writes, I'm looking for a recommendation. I've been trying out Jellyfin as a media server on a Raspberry Pi, among other things, and ended up liking it so much that I started depending on it. Recently, it started acting up though, and it got me thinking that I'd like a separate machine acting as a NAS/media server. It wouldn't need to be beefy. I don't need to transcode any media. I just need the capability to run Linux. I don't think I want to learn a BSD for one machine, and a CPU and RAM to deal with the rest. Also, enough disk space to store my stuff. I suppose a couple of terabytes of hard drives should do it for now. Can you recommend any hardware for this use case? I don't want to spend a ton of money, but I also don't have any experience with building PCs myself, because I'm more of a software person. Are pre-built ones like Synology worth the price? Some people recommended old laptops or NUCs to me, but they wouldn't have enough disk space, I think, and if I recall correctly, the most reliable option are SATA drives, which wouldn't work in this case. The sheer number of options is a bit overwhelming for me. Also, I've never done any sort of RAID array myself. Is that the recommended way of setting it up for more resilience?
First of all, you asked for hardware recommendations, so let's get to that. You said you can fit everything on a couple of hard drives, which means that a NUC form factor probably is what you're really looking for here. Now, I would probably recommend something from Minis Forum. You can Google them. They're on Amazon, or you can order directly from them. Not all of their models have 2 drive bays internally, but quite a few of them do, and they're relatively inexpensive, small form factor, pretty quiet, high quality, low power consumption. Seems like it's going to be perfect for your use case, and they're just generic x86 PCs, so you can install whatever distribution you'd like. Now, beyond that, I would like to push back a little bit. You said that it needs to run Linux, and you don't think you want to learn BSD from one machine. If this is just going to be a NAS, you may want to use a BSD-based distro, which is not going to require you to learn BSD. However, you can use a NAS-based distro to take a lot of the donkey work of setting it up away. Now, that may appeal, that may not appeal. If you just really want to set everything up vanilla for yourself, I am not even going to try to talk you out of that. However, if you find that daunting and you're thinking, well, I would really like to just install something and immediately have working access with a web interface to everything from NFS to Samba to iSCSI to you name it, you have several options. The first couple that I'll throw out there are, in fact, BSD based, and that would be the very well-known TrueNAS and the less well-known XigmaNAS. TrueNAS is the name for what used to be FreeNAS, and XigmaNAS is the name for what used to be NAS for Free, which in turn is a fork of the original FreeNAS code prior to the IX Systems acquisition. Either of them will do what you would like. I personally tend to be fonder of XigmaNAS because it's much lighter weight, and I find it more responsive and just less quirky. But if you want all the shiny features, including lots of stuff with built-in jails, and I believe there's even Beehive virtualization support built into newer versions of TrueNAS, then that's the direction that you want to go. You can also, if you want to go the TrueNAS route, you can go TrueNAS Scale, which brings you right back to the Linux base instead of the BSD base. However, again, I wouldn't really recommend that. TrueNAS Scale is a lot newer than the original TrueNAS, and I have not used it in anger myself, but just kind of judging from the volume of I had problems with this that I see, flowing across the web, I think that you're liable to encounter more problems right now with Scale for a relatively generic, like I just want a NAS, than you would with vanilla TrueNAS.
Yeah, it's just not as mature at this point, is it?
Exactly. So personally, my recommendations would go first XigmaNAS and then TrueNAS Scale, but I've told you all the reasons why, so feel free to reorder that any way that works better for you.
So sounds like what you're looking for is relatively small. I'm really not used to thinking that small. So normally what I recommend for NAS is you can just get any old computer case that will hold, the 4 to 6 hard drives you normally would want for a smallish home NAS, and a low-end Intel or AMD CPU, and just a generic computer like you would build anywhere. And there's lots of guides on doing that. There's also guides on setting up the software side of it and the hardware choices part of it on Clara's website. I can drop some links in the show notes for that too. But really, it's fairly straightforward, the same way you build a PC, although I know you said you've not really done that before.
Yeah, but building a PC is not that hard. There's plenty of guides on it, and it's just like Lego, really.
It really is just like Lego. I mean, it's literally how I learned to build PCs, is I bought a bunch of parts and I put them together into a PC. Had never done that before, didn't have anybody to teach me, but it was like, look, I got a screwdriver. How hard can this be?
One thing I would say, though, is if Jellyfin is a big part of this, then consider getting an Intel CPU that supports QuickSync. Because although you don't want to do transcoding, at least to start out with, maybe you will down the road. And if you get an Intel CPU that doesn't support QuickSync, you may regret that. So I think it's maybe like 7th and 8th gen i5s and 7s and stuff that support it, but you'd have to check the specific model of the CPU that you're looking at.
You specifically asked about pre-built NAS like Synology's. Synology and Netgear are probably the two most commonly encountered in the very small business and, like home enthusiast market. I would definitely recommend Synology over Netgear, although either are really entirely adequate. It's important to understand what you're getting when you get one of those, which is a very, very low performance ARM processor with not a lot of RAM, enough bays to stick your things in, and a custom distribution. Underneath the hood, both Synology and Netgear are using the ButterFS file system. Crucially, neither one is feeding all the disks to ButterFS as a ButterFS array. They have different ways of handling it, but both devices use a combination of MD-RAID and Butter so that Butter never thinks it has more than one disk, and you avoid pretty much all of the really ugly use cases that have me screaming about how you shouldn't use Butter all the time. So yeah, those are totally both very worthwhile options. I will mention again, very low performance CPUs and very small amount of RAM in those. That can absolutely make itself felt, especially if you end up wanting to try to do something like run apps directly on the NAS, which in some cases you may or may not even be able to do with a proprietary custom built NAS because you're not getting full access to like a whole distro. There's just no provision for that.
It is worth mentioning that some of the Synology boxes do have x86 CPUs, but you massively, massively overpay for them.
Those are not worth it. Please, for the love of God, don't buy one of those Synologies with an x86 Xeon in it.
Yeah, or they even have some Atom ones and stuff, or they've had in the past, and they're just massively overpriced, especially compared to a used desktop, you can get a used desktop, especially an old one, for next to nothing. People are like throwing them in dumpsters at this point.
You should also be incredibly careful about buying, gear like NASs or routers that say they have an Atom CPU in them, because usually when you see that, what that really means is they have got a several years old design called Avoton. Avoton was incredibly promising when it came out. It was essentially a very lightweight and low power consumption version of the Xeon. It didn't cost a whole lot, and it performed incredibly well, for both the price point entry and for the power consumption of it. The problem is there was a flaw in that design, and all the Avoton power devices started, dropping like flies a couple of years after they came out. There's still a lot of companies that are trying to work through massive stockpiles of those Avoton processors and boards. And don't be surprised if you buy one of those and it fails in about 18 to 24 months. That happens to a lot of those. So it says Atom on the tin, do some real research, find the model number, check it, make sure it's not an Avoton.
Yeah, if power consumption is important to you, then a Celeron J series, like a J1800 or a J1900, you can get those dirt cheap, and they've usually got a couple of SATA ports on them, so they might be worth looking at.
Yeah, I should mention that as well. When I recommended those Minis Forum small form factor PCs, we're talking about your desire for proper SATA connectivity, which is absolutely warranted. You did receive that message correctly. You do want real SATA connections, for your NAS. You do not want to do USB. The Minis Forums, they can all accommodate more than one SATA drive that I've seen. Not all of them have the physical bay on the inside to slide two 2.5-inch form factor drives. However, all that stuff is in specs on Minis Forum's site. You can look it up. You can find the exact model that you want. Easy peasy. There are plenty of other small form factor PC manufacturers out there. One of my other favorites is a Chinese brand called Chotom, Qotom. However, I don't think they're likely to be as appropriate here. Their devices are a lot more likely to get used in industrial circumstances for purposes more along the lines of routers and like tiny edge application servers. And I don't think I've ever seen a Chotom that had dual internal bays, and they frequently don't even have dual internal SATA ports. They will have SATA connectivity, but it's usually just going to be one port, or maybe one SATA and one NVMe if you get one of the newer ones.
What I did with the machine that I built with the J1800 board was I added a PCIe card that gave me, I think, an extra 2 or 4 SATA ports internally, which is not great for performance, but if it's only you using it at home, then it's not going to be a huge issue.
There's nothing wrong performance-wise with a PCIe SATA controller add-on. That's perfectly fine. Now, if you used a relatively inexpensive one, it's probably not going to be any faster than your motherboard SATA was, but it's probably also not going to be any slower. You don't really need to get into the big, like the LSI 9300 series host bus adapters, that kind of gear. You don't really need that unless you're looking for more than roughly 650 megabytes per second throughput.
Yeah, and good luck with that if you're not having more than 6 hard drives.
Yeah. It's a huge concern if you've got, 8 bays or more and you plan to get all the performance you can out of it. It is not a big concern with 2 bays. Honestly, it's not a big concern with 2 bays, even if you're running those 2 bays in RAID 0, let alone if you're using the second bay as redundancy.
But do use at least 2 hard drives and have some redundancy. Like, I know it's your NAS and maybe it's only your media, but you will be very upset with yourself, especially since you say the reason why you're moving this from a Raspberry Pi is you've come to depend on it. So have some redundancy. I know it hurts to buy a bit of extra storage that you're not getting the use out of, but you will be very glad when whatever type of RAID you decide to use, hint, use ZFS, protects you from having to rebuild all of that over again.
Yeah, it prevents you from having to copy it all from your backups, which you are definitely doing. Because as the t-shirt that we should make and sell for loads of money says, RAID is not a backup.
Why aren't we selling those t-shirts? Joe, we need to sell some freaking t-shirts.
We really, really do. Right, well, we'd better get out of here then. Remember, show@2.5admins.com if you want to send any questions or feedback. You can find me at joerest.com/mastodon.
And you can find me at jrs-s.net/social.
And I'm at Allan Jude.
See you next week.